Good evening. My name is Daphne Banai. I've been a מחסוםווטש activist for nearly 20 years, 15 of them in the Palestinian Jordan Valley. I'm often asked, how do you stand it? The pain, the frustration, the extreme heat, and the long drives. I wish to answer them. It's the people who give me strength, the Palestinian inhabitants of the Jordan Valley. They're simple people, poor, warm people who, in spite of everything you'll see, have not become hateful, and their brave stance, their insistence on holding on to the land and to their way of life is simply inspiring. Their story is what I wish to give a voice to. The story of an ongoing quiet transfer done under the auspices of the Israeli law and in violation of international law. It's 3 a.m., August 5th, 2019. Grandpa and Grandma Kaabne load their meager belongings on a platform connected to a tractor, and their 5 children, their daughter-in-law Sarah and her children, 2-year-old Khaled and 40 days old baby Hannah. Only Odo, Sarah's husband and the eldest son, remains with the sheep in Khadidiyah. It's dark outside, and the family begins its frightened journey to Jiftlik village, where they will crowd along with other families in a tiny area. However, the family never made it to the Jiftlik. An Israeli truck whose driver fell asleep, or maybe didn't notice in the dark the limping tractor coming in his direction, hit the platform and threw its passengers and their belongings in all directions. Baby Hannah did not make it to her 34th day alive and was killed instantly. Her mother Sarah was critically injured and was rushed to Hadassah Hospital in Jerusalem, where she would only regain consciousness a month and a half later after numerous operations. The grandfather suffered a shattered arm, and 5-year-old Hamza sustained a head wound. A day before the Kaabne's family's hurried escape from Al-Khadidiyah, an Israeli army officer came along with Roi's settlement security officer and told the head of the family, "I warn you, if you are still here tomorrow morning, we'll confiscate everything that you have, including the tractor and the tents, everything." 2 weeks earlier, the army demolished the home of Ode and Sarah, their parents, children, and brothers. I came there 2 hours later, and here's what I wrote in my מחסוםווטש report dated July 21st, 2019. The father and the 2 children, 5 and 10 years old, were walking around in the sun and pointing to a taboon, an outdoor cooking stove that was still smoking, the kitchen utensils, and a pile of mattresses upon which a goat was sleeping. Everything was sitting outside in the sun without any shelter or purpose. No tears were shed here. They appeared to be complacent with their fate because they have no control over it and have nowhere else to go. It is clear to them that wherever they go, the most moral army in the world will chase after them, and they can't do anything about it. We met the family 2 years before that, when Israel demolished the home of the young couple that they have built in the Jiftlik a year earlier, and Khaled had just been born. They were 2 20-year-olds who looked like 2 kids no older than 12-year-old, and they were so lost, so despairing. Since I saw that they were Bedouins, I asked where they were from originally. "It makes no difference," the father said quietly. "We can't go back there anyway." I insisted, and he said that they were from Beersheba, in Israel. And ever since that original sin of the great expulsion of 1948, the Palestinians build and we Israelis demolish. They move elsewhere with a shadow of hope, and we expel them. For this is the reality in the Jordan Valley. Since 1967, Israel does not allow any construction in the area, and therefore all their attempts to build are illegal and subject to demolitions. The only question is when, in 45 centigrade heat or in the winter floods. The Palestinian Jordan Valley constitutes 1/3 of the West Bank and is the most vital for a Palestinian state when that happens. This is the most significant ground reserve and the only contact of the West Bank with the outside world. All those crowded and isolated segments under Palestinian rule that have no contact with each other or with the world at large could never constitute an independent and sustainable entity without the Jordan Valley. On the other hand, Israel wishes to annex it for the very same reasons. The security reason, a buffer between Israel and Jordan, does not hold now in the age of long-range missiles, and certainly not while Israel maintains a peace treaty with Jordan. And anyway, is it really worth it to risk the treaty with Jordan only in order to annex that narrow and insignificant strip of land to Israel? Security-wise, the Palestinian Jordan Valley is the calmest area in the entire West Bank, and yet the toughest oppression measures are taken there, since the interest behind them is to reduce the local population by a quiet transfer, making life so unbearable for the Palestinians that they finally leave and move to Area A by physical disconnection of the Jordan Valley from their center of life in the West Bank, by severe denial of water, by frequent home demolitions and confiscations, frequent evictions due to military maneuvers, and more. For all those reasons, only 4% of the valley's fertile soil is farmed by Palestinians, while Jews farm unhampered, flourishing, and based on cheap exploitative Arab labor. Take a look at this map of the Jordan Valley. The details are not important. What do you see? You see gray. Almost all of the Jordan Valley is gray. There are some yellow spots in where the Palestinian Authority is in control, but all the rest is gray. The gray areas signify the areas that are not allowed for Palestinians for various reasons. In all the years since the occupation, Israel has declared most of the Jordan Valley closed military zones and nature reserve, and they are out of bounds for Palestinians to live, to farm, and to graze their flocks. Palestinians have lived there for generations, long before Israel occupied their area. They farmed and grazed there. With this declaration, they have become illegal in their own homes. The declaration dispossesses them of most of the valley. Firing Zone 903, for example, the Zuka Reserve, stole about 80,000 dunams of land from the Palestinians, most of which is privately owned. In this more detailed map, you can see the various excuses used to prohibit the Palestinians from living and even passing in these areas. The red, nearly half of the land, is firing zone, the green is nature reserve, and the brown was created from the two sorts overlapping, an absurdity because firing in the middle of a nature reserve can cause bushfires, such as the one that burned the Zuka Reserve in 2014, causing horrendous damage to the flora and fauna. In 2009, Israel placed signs announcing firing zone no entry at the entrance to every home and every encampment in the Jordan Valley. In those military zones, Israel demolishes more frequently homes, sheep pens, water tanks, solar power panels, and more. It confiscates farming equipment, tractors, and water tankers that happen to pass by, as well as livestock. The army chases Palestinian shepherds away from these grazing grounds and arrests them. For example, this fine was given to 3 separate shepherds for cows moving about in the Zuka Reserve while not on the marked path. Well, there are no marked paths, nor any shades or the likes in this reserve. It is a totally wild and neglected area. A month ago, the same family had 4 of their cows confiscated at the same reserve for entering it by the nature reserve inspector who arrived accompanied by 2 settlers who live in that very, very same reserve. They had to pay 6,000 shekels, 1,500 for each cow to get them back. Those are the poorest of the poor. They live in tents, they sleep on the floor, they live off some milk and cheese that they sell. This sum of money is a whole lifetime earning. Most of them in the heart of the firing zones, nature reserves. Not only does Israel not implement the construction laws against them, or distance them because of the area's military status, it even helps them with electricity, water, well-paved roads, and protection. All the while, Palestinians are prohibited from accessing the areas, some of which are privately owned by the Palestinians and have been their source of livelihood for generations. It's not an unusual sight. Soldiers chase away or detain Palestinians within the firing zones, and an hour later they're seen relaxed, sipping coffee at the settlers' outpost, which is also situated inside the firing zone. For example, Uri's outpost, now called Nof Gilad, was built inside firing zone 903 and the Zuka Nature Reserve about 3 years ago. He is active over 2,000 dunams raising cattle and tending fields inside these firing zones and nature reserve areas. These days, the settlers are erecting a 15-kilometer fence inside the firing zone and nature reserve. This fence, absolutely illegal, will block the Palestinians' access to their lands and wreak final havoc on numerous Jordan Valley communities. Those settlers violently chase away Palestinian shepherds, galloping on their horses and mini-tractors into the flocks, wounding and killing sheep and making pregnant sheep miscarry. They trample fields which Palestinians have labored to tend, entering them with cattle and mini-tractors and ruining the crops. We have documented dozens of cases of violence of outpost settlers against the Palestinian shepherds. Activists of Maxsomwatch and other organizations accompany the Palestinians so they can access their land, plow and sow, and graze their flocks and protect them against settler violence. The Israeli army and police do all they can to distance us and enable the settlers to exert free violence against the Palestinians. We accompanied Palestinian shepherd M one day at his request after a settler from Hamra colony attacked him several times. In our presence, the Israeli army and police arrested the Palestinian. His mother came crying and begging to let him go, and when he was finally released, the policeman took him aside and warned him that now that he has the shepherd's name and ID number, if he dare bring us along Israeli activists again, he would be arrested for 3 months. The Palestinian is completely in the hands of the army and is torn between the terror of the settlers and that of the military and the police. He asked us not to come, and soon enough he was attacked again by the settlers. In recent days, armed Israeli soldiers are going among encampments, scaring families and their children and warning the shepherds not to bring Israeli activists to accompany them. When 8 armed soldiers surround your tent with drawn rifles, it becomes a very real threat. I myself witnessed it one evening. This all attests to the fact that declaring firing zones and nature reserves is meant to push the Palestinians out and remove them from the area, the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian Jordan Valley. Since the occupation of the West Bank in 1967, Israel has refused to issue any construction permit to Palestinians in the Jordan Valley. Therefore, nearly all Palestinian houses in the Jordan Valley are illegal. All structures and infrastructures have demolition orders that are implemented without any warning, so that everyone there lives under constant existential threat. The worst affected are small children. Suddenly, in the middle of the night, they wake up to the booms of bulldozers demolishing everything they know and all that protects them. I wrote about such a child, a 6-year-old boy whose home was demolished 3 times in a single year in 2015 and 16. A Maxsomwatch report from August 9, 2016. A psychologist from the Spanish chapter of Physicians Without Borders came to the flattened area that had been the home of the Abu Zaid family in an attempt to help cope with 6-year-old Ibrahim's dire mental condition. But Ibrahim wasn't there. He had spent the night in the Jericho hospital with his mother Hajar and his uncle Adnan after having suffered a sunstroke. How could he not? All day yesterday he was running around in the seething sun of the Jordan Valley, 45 degrees centigrade in the shade, until he began to vomit and had convulsions. Ibrahim's story is nothing new. The psychologist has been seeing him for the past year. In August 2015, the giant army bulldozers demolished the measly dwellings of Ibrahim's parents and that of the neighbors, and something sprang in Ibrahim's head, as the psychologist has put it. In Israel, this would be called post-traumatic stress. This recent February, the army demolished Ibrahim's home yet again. Ibrahim stopped functioning. He never rests, and his conduct is frantic, uncontrolled, and as if someone is constantly chasing him. The family was expelled from En-Gedi in 1948, from Al-Uja in 1998, and is now holding on, teeth and nails, onto the arid, stony ground of Fasail, for it has no longer anywhere to flee to. His mother is constantly chasing him for fear he might do himself harm. But who can get a grip on him? His tormented mind allows him no rest. But last Saturday, Ibrahim calmed down a bit. Dozens of Israelis, at the initiative of Combatants for Peace, came to the hamlet and together built an amusement corner for Ibrahim and the other children. A place of smiles and joy. Ibrahim, in his own tiny hands, shaped the mud-built seats, decorated them with paints, and dreamt. The next day, the bulldozers returned, waking him up before dawn, and demolished his home yet again. We came to Fasail to support, to help somewhat, and show solidarity, but in view of the evil and the cruelty that reigns, all we could offer was our helpless shame. On August 8, 2016, Israel persisted in its attempts to expel the Palestinians from the Jordan Valley. They demolished 4 homes, leaving 16 human beings homeless, of which 10 are children. We have noticed that August, the hottest month of the year, temperature averaging well over 40 degrees, is Israel's preferred demolition month. The children and the elderly are thrown out to the searing sun, and then the Israeli soldiers flee to their air-conditioned barracks. For it is not planning and supervision that guide their actions, but the will to harm as effectively as possible the weakest population around in order to be rid of them. In the past, many have lived in stone houses, and this is attested by aerial photos. However, stone houses were demolished by Israel, and the inhabitants have been forbidden to rebuild. This has forced them into a life of poverty, exposed to the harsh weather conditions of the desert, since they dare not actually rebuild massive shelters, fearing demolitions. In recent months, demolitions in the Palestinian Jordan Valley have intensified as part of the state's effort to empty the area of Palestinians and make annexation, so desired by Israeli governments, that much easier. Israel has demolished hundreds of dwellings in the past few years, and not only dwellings, sheep pens as well, a demolition that leaves the animals in the seething sun at 40 degrees centigrade and actually kills many of them, especially the lambs that have no chance of surviving the extreme summer heat and the winter cold. Israel destroys and confiscates crucially important farming equipment: tractors, cars, water tanks, outhouses donated by the EU, solar panels. It destroys water cisterns storing rainwater and hundreds of olive trees. Yes, even for trees Palestinians need license that are not to be had. During the many years of my activity in the Palestinian Jordan Valley, I witnessed dozens of cases of house demolition and looked in the eyes of people who became homeless, and every single one breaks my heart. We who are safe and sound in our homes could never understand the intolerable pain of those whose home has become a pile of rubble and twisted iron rods, and all their belongings is thrown to the street and scattered around. For 40 years, Mari worked for Mekkarot, saving his money day by day, and now, at the age of 70, he built a home for himself and for his son and for their families. The Israeli army needed no more than 30 minutes to demolish it in 2017. The reaction of people whose house was destroyed literally reminds me of human bereavement, the despair, the horrid helplessness, because in a way, a destroyed home is much like the shattering of life itself. No need to dig in detail into this page. It's just an example of the extent of demolitions in less than a month, from September 24th to October 20th, how many demolitions and confiscation Israel exercised in the Jordan Valley, which is a very small area. These demolitions have reached their peak on November 3rd, 2020, under the cover of the presidential elections in the United States, as Israel erased the entire village, 3 kilometers of total destruction, not leaving a thing on the ground. This is the description I got a few hours later. 10 minutes was the time the villagers of Khumsa were allowed to get their belongings out before the bulldozers would destroy their shanties. 10 minutes. For the first 5 minutes, no one could move for mere shock. 9 bulldozers and hundreds of soldiers and vehicles landed on them at 2 p.m. And then amok run. What can we salvage? Mattresses, blankets. What about the clothes and the food and the refrigerator? Perhaps pictures of the kids and that of Mama and Papa. For sheer confusion, hardly anything was salvaged. And the bulldozers, they didn't hesitate. They trampled everything: tents, electrical appliances, solar panels, water tanks, outhouses donated by the EU, and all the personal belongings. Entire lives of clothes and souvenirs and jewelry, everything was destroyed. Even the sheep pen and their feed were trampled. And who would protect the sheep and the lambs? 75 women and men, the ill, the elderly, and 45 children were standing as evening fell under the open sky, not knowing where they should go. At 2 a.m., the Red Crescent brought them a few pup tents, and the people crawled inside, each hugging a lamb to preserve its body heat so it would not die. In its 50 years of occupation, while destroying hundreds of houses belonging to Palestinians who have lived in the Jordan Valley for generations, Israel has built thousands of homes for Jews it imported to the Jordan Valley, some with official license and others even contrary to Israel's own racist laws. This whole time, Israel has not demolished one single Jewish home in the entire area. Abu Bakr Basharat, popular philosopher and leader, is my good friend. I met him 13 years ago on the day his home was demolished and he was forced to move elsewhere. During the night in which Israel demolished his home, his youngest daughter was born, and he named her Sumud, meaning holding on to the land. This is what he says. I represent 3 communities, El-Khadidiyeh, Makhul, and Khumsa. Before the settler colonies were founded, right after 67 occupation, 300 families lived in these communities. Between 2,000 and 2,500 people. Now, only 35 families are left, numbering perhaps 350 people. Before the occupation, we were farmers. We had fields and livestock, but without water, you can do nothing. We became shepherds only. And now, everyone had to sell their sheep because we have no grazing grounds. If you try to bring sheep feed, the army confiscates it. When we tried to prepare an access track to the road so our children can get to their school bus, the army dug the track up and blocked it with a dirt dike. When we tried to bring water by pipe from Tamun in the Palestinian area, the army cut the pipes. We have not a drop of water, and although we live right near the Mekorot pumps, we look with envy at the lawns and pools in the Rouot settlement. They need not demolish our homes in order to chase us out. There are other ways too. I have no water. My water has been taken. Every summer I hear the Jewish settlers of the Jordan Valley whining on the radio and TV that they have no water, while splashing around in their swimming pools and on the bright green lawns of their homes. The Palestinians have stolen all of our water, they say. But let's get the facts right. The water in the Jordan Valley, all of it, like any other natural resource, actually belongs to the area's legal inhabitants, the Palestinians. Israel, as the temporary sovereign, may use some of this water as well, but international law stipulates that the water belongs to the Palestinians. In reality, Israel took over all the water in the West Bank in a military order on August 1967, and since then, the Palestinians are not allowed to pump water without permission. It provides water to the Jewish colonies in the Palestinian Jordan Valley, and only to them. It does not provide any to the Palestinians, except for a few villages in the northern and central parts of the valley, as compensation for having dried up their wells with its overpumping. Most Palestinians in the Jordan Valley do not receive a drop of water from the state, and they are forced to bring water in tankers from the areas that are controlled by the Palestinian Authority at great distance. Moreover, the Mekorot pumps are located in the heart of the Palestinian villages that are legally under Palestinian control, transferring almost all of their water to the settlements and drying up the villages themselves. Only 1/3 of the wells the Palestinians used before 1967 are working nowadays. There are two reasons for this. One is that Israel pumps water at depth of 300 meters and more, while Palestinians are not allowed to pump deeper than 150 meters. The second is the aging of Palestinian pumping equipment. Since 1967, they are forbidden to repair, renovate, replace parts, or change a single thing in their wells without a permit, which is not issued. Can mechanical equipment survive over 50 years without maintenance? The Palestinians keep requesting such permission time and again to refurbish some of their wells. For the past 2 years, an in-principle permission to renovate 52 Palestinian wells in the Jordan Valley has been sitting on the table of the Israeli-Palestinian Water Commission, but it doesn't reach a final phase. Perhaps because the chairman of the Jordan Valley, David El-Khayani, who also heads the Samaria and Judea Settler Council, is strongly opposed to provide any water to the Palestinians. At the same time, nowadays, Israel is digging a new, deeper and super modern well in the Jordan Valley, while it's not permitting Palestinians to dig any wells on their property. Jasser Fahed looks sadly on the rows of banana trees lining the grove he received from his father, who also got it from his own father, and on and on. Many generations at El Uja raised bananas, oranges, and lemons. It was called the Green Gold because of its rich farming. Now he has decided that this is the last year for such crops because he has no water. Like many other farmers at El Uja, he has decided to give up the long tradition of farming. The El Uja spring lies a few kilometers west of the village. Until 1967, when Israel took over, the spring was full of water and it had provided for the whole area with advanced irrigation ditches. The water current was so strong that Palestinians considered using it to generate electrical power. Since 2003, Israel has built 3 giant water pumping installations that transfer all the water to the Jewish settlements. This has dried up all the Palestinian wells in the area, and at present El Uja does not even have enough water for personal hygiene and drinking. Every settler receives 18 times more water than Palestinians for agriculture. A settler consumes on the average 487 liters a day, 8 times the amount a Palestinian consumes, while the vast Palestinian shepherd communities receive no water at all, 0 water. Note that the World Health Organization recommends a minimum of 100 liters a day, while the average Palestinian in the Jordan Valley receives only 60 liters. This is a comparison of daily domestic water consumption in neighboring communities. Note that El Uja, the village with plentiful water, the green gold, receives today less than a minimum amount recommended by the International Health Organization. The cost of monthly water consumption per settler colonist amount to 105 shekels. The cost of monthly water consumption per Palestinian shepherd, 1,744 shekels. Almost the entire income of these farmers goes on water. In these next pictures, you see neighboring communities in the Jordan Valley. The green lawns in Keckaot and the shepherd community of El Hadidiyah north of it, the swimming pool in Keckaot and Khumsa to its east. See the difference of the colors. The Israeli army confiscates and ruins water tanks, pipes, and pumping equipment, even cuts pipes that would bring water from the areas under Palestinian control, and prevents the repair of rainwater cisterns. All this attests to the fact that the purpose of water prevention is to transfer the Palestinian population, break them until they get up and leave. 3 villages in the northern Palestinian Jordan Valley, Bardala, Kardala, and El El-Beda, are located over a huge underground water reservoir. Until 1967, they were rich providers of farm produce, wonderful and plentiful fruit and vegetables. Since 1967, Israel, through its water company Makkorot, has dug wells 300 meters deep in the heart of Bardala and has dried up the Palestinian wells. All 3 villages have remained without water until the early 70s, when Israel reached an agreement with the head of the villages that Israel would provide the villages with 240 cubic meters a day out of the tremendous amount of water it takes away. With the years, this quantity has been reduced while the need of the villagers has grown, so that now each of the 3 villages receives less than 100 cubic meters a day, while Israel pumps about 30,000 cubic meters a day from Bardala alone and transfers it to the settlers of the Jordan Valley. The Palestinians, in their distress, have connected themselves to the pipes leading water from the Makkorot installation to the settler colonies, and when Israel found out, it cut the Palestinian pipes. Thus, many fields dried out, and many of Bardala's farmers could not maintain their livelihood. Palestinian villages, once rich in water, now turned into beggars, waiting to receive a minimum of water from Israel, and even this is not given. In some of the firing zones, the Israeli army conducts frequent maneuvers that are a source of extensive suffering for the Palestinian population. The army forces the inhabitants to leave their homes for hours or days. They must abandon their property and their homes and seek shelter in the open desert in the inhuman heat of the summer and frozen winter nights. The Palestinians are evicted in this way between 8 and 12 times a year. The following is a testimony of Dunya Abulkbash, 34 years old, married and mother of 7, of June 13, 2018. Every time we were evicted, the soldiers drove behind us and drove us as if we were sheep, without a bit of humanity and compassion. We hurried so much that we forgot to take food and drink with us. I am a mother of 7 small children. I have a child with Down syndrome and a baby less than a month old. It was so hot, like fire. What could we do? The first 2 times we were driven out this year, we remained like that, exposed to the burning sun from 6 a.m. until afternoon. Once we received 2 tents from the Red Crescent, and that was a bit of a relief. But our hearts were heavy with concern for the homes and property we left behind. We heard shots, and it was very scary. It sounded like war. The children were terrified and trembled with fear. We felt it took an eternity until we were allowed to return. Every time we were evicted, we returned exhausted to our tents, and everyone began checking their place and counting the sheep. We were most worried about the little lambs that we could not take with us when we were evicted. They are in danger, still suckling and remaining for hours without food and drink. We don't know what to do. They want to throw us out of here, but we have nowhere to go. They want to make us miserable until we decide to leave, so no Palestinian would remain in the whole area. Many maneuvers are held in May-June, months that are especially hot in the Jordan Valley, and the wheat has not yet been harvested. The army tanks trample the wheat fields, and the firing of ammunition sets hundreds of wheat and barley growing fields on fire, crops which the local villagers labored to raise and in which they invested all their meager finances. When Palestinians summon the army that maintains fire extinguishing vehicles in every one of its bases to help put out the fires, They never ever come. The Palestinians then fight the fire with their bare hands, helped by wet sandbags. The impoverished Palestinians have thus suffered incredible damages. The purpose here is to make them leave and to prevent Palestinian regional development. This is backed up by the words of Lieutenant General Einaf Shalev at the Knesset Subcommittee on Foreign Affairs and Defense in August 2014. Wherever we lowered the frequency of maneuvers significantly, and we did, wild weeds have grown. This is something that must be taken into account. And he added that where the army marches, people move aside, and I do not distinguish here between Jews and Arabs. It's very interesting, as the army never marches where Jews live. The Jordan Valley, as we have said, is security-wise the calmest part of the entire West Bank, and still severe movement restrictions are maintained there. 3 temporary checkpoints monitor the movement of Palestinians into and from the Palestinian Jordan Valley. They are operated from time to time arbitrarily, so that a Palestinian who ventures out of his home never knows when or if at all he will make it to his destination. Israel has erected and is maintaining various barriers that hamper movement inside the area: ditches, dirt dikes, giant boulders, and agricultural gates, all aimed at restricting the Palestinian movement in the region. The aim of the checkpoints and barriers is to disconnect the Jordan Valley from the central West Bank, the communities from each other, and the access road from the main roads, thus stifling the inhabitants economically and thinning out the population in order to make future annexation to the State of Israel all the more feasible. One must keep in mind that there are no shops nor services such as medical and health care, nor schools in the Jordan Valley. Its inhabitants are totally dependent on their connection with the rest of the West Bank. Because of such barriers, reaching Tamun villages in the center of the West Bank at a distance of less than 10 kilometers as the crow flies becomes a 50-60 kilometer long ride. Not all of our activity is heartbreaking or frustrating. We do have some fun days too. A group of women from Maxomåtch organizes every year a day at the beach. It's called Min al-Bakhar. They bring Palestinians from all over the West Bank to the beaches, and those are wonderful, joyful days. This year, because of COVID-19, we couldn't bring children in buses to the beach, and we decided to have our own little day of joy in the Jordan Valley. There is a small fountain in the Jordan Valley called Ein Sakut, and the inhabitants of the Jordan Valley don't go there. They don't even know it exists. Yeah, actually they do know it exists, but they have no means of going, and they're afraid of the water. So we got together and took some 15 mothers and about 20 to 30 kids to the fountain. It was a wonderful day. The kids jumped around and played in the water. Each one of us took a child to the deep water in order not to lose some children on the way. And the women who work so hard, who have such a hard life in the Jordan Valley, were laughing and singing and splashing at each other. It was a real day of joy. And for the finale, a small but touching story. On our way out of Fasail after demolitions of homes there, we saw those 2 young boys standing there, and they called out to us and invited us to have a sip of cold water. We came over and we drank water, and the water was ice cold. A rarity in the Jordan Valley. We asked those kids how come, and they told us that a few months ago their grandfather has died, and they thought about a way to commemorate him. And they had the idea that offering water to people who are passers-by, Jews and Arabs, no matter who, is a beautiful way to commemorate their grandfather. So they pulled a water hose from their home that is behind this fence, and they set up a cooler, an electrical cooler on the other side of this wall, and they're offering everyone who passes by some cold water. And on the left you see a date tree. Everyone in season, everyone is invited to eat of the dates, and from this sink there's a hose going and watering the tree to save the water that drips down. It was very, very touching, the story of the young boys, and every time we pass there we wash our faces with ice cold water and we drink water, and we're always accompanied by children rushing to us and shouting hello and shalom. The expulsion of inhabitants of the occupied territory from their homes and lands constitutes forced transfer of a protected population and is considered a war crime. Whether direct or indirect violence is exerted, either physical or administrative. Whether such expulsion is executed by force or by creating a reality that does not enable life and forces the inhabitants to leave their homes and lands, the essence is the same. All persons involved in committing such a crime, including Israel's Prime Minister, Minister of Defense, judges who ratify expulsion, and regional general commanders signing the orders, all bear personal responsibility for it. All that the Palestinian inhabitants of the Jordan Valley wish is to live in security and peace. It is our duty, legal, moral, and humanitarian, to enable them to do so.